Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to this deep dive. We've got quite a stack of sources here that really drill down into some fundamental and, yeah, sometimes uncomfortable truths about human nature, groups, and how we think.
Exactly. We're pulling from thinkers you might know, maybe some you don't. Classic crowd psychologists like Laban and Tard. Some sharp minds on elite theory. Think Michel's, Malik.
Right. And then the early pioneers of propaganda, people like Lippmann and Bernays.
Yeah. But we're also connecting those dots to psychologists like William James, Wilfred Bion, and even military strategy with John Boyd. It's a really fascinating mix.
It really is. And our mission for this deep dive, well, it's pretty clear. We want to cut through the noise, extract the most important nuggets from all this material, explore those powerful forces shaping our beliefs and behaviors in groups, try to understand the structures of power these thinkers saw.
And really grapple with that challenge, the challenge of individual thought when you're up against all this pressure.
And crucially, we're going to circle back. We're going to reiterate those core ideas to make sure they really stick.
Right. Get ready for some maybe surprising facts and perhaps a few aha moments about why we believe what we believe.
And maybe why it's so tough to challenge those beliefs. Okay, let's dive in.
So right off the bat, the sources highlight this fundamental tension. It feels incredibly relevant still. Wilfred Trotter, looking at what he called the herd instinct.
Yeah.
He described it as this constant struggle between herd suggestion and sense experience.
That contrast seems key. It's basically asking, do you believe something because, well, everyone around you does? That's the herd suggestion, imitation, like Tardy talked about.
Or do you believe it because you've seen it, you've experienced it, you've checked it out yourself, your own senses? That's the sense experience side.
And the sources are pretty clear. There are big trade-offs here. Trotter argued that, going with the herd, accepting that suggestion, it often makes life easier.
Smoother social interactions, definitely. Psychological comfort. You're not sticking out, you fit in.
But the flip side, relying only on your own sense experience, well, it might give you a more accurate picture of reality, maybe, but it can seriously isolate you.
Oh, yeah. The group doesn't always appreciate the person who sees things differently.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The classic crowd psychologists, Laban, Card, they saw crowds as something fundamentally different than just a bunch of individuals.
Right. They argued crowds tend towards this uniformity of opinion, and they're inherently intolerant of anyone who deviates.
Makes sense if you think about it. If this sort of group mind takes over, any dissenting voice feels like a threat to that new unity.
Everett Dean Martin even went further. He described crowds as almost being creatures of hate.
Wow.
Especially towards those who don't conform within the group or, towards other rival crowds. It's like you reinforce your identity by defining who you're not.
So, okay, that's our first core takeaway then, the one we really need to emphasize right from the start. There's this deep-seated conflict, the powerful pull of the herd versus the, well, potentially isolating path of independent observation. Fitting in often means accepting the group's reality, even if it clashes with what you see yourself.
And there's a real social cost if you step outside that circle. This tension, it really underlies almost everything else we're going to talk about.
That dynamic definitely explains a lot about group behavior. So if crowds push for uniformity, how do ideas and behaviors actually become uniform? How does that happen?
Well, that's where Gabriel Tard's work on imitation and invention is so foundational. He saw social change starting with an individual invention, a new idea, a new way of doing something.
Okay.
But the real power, he argued, is how it spreads. And it spreads through imitation, just replicating throughout the social body.
And it's not always a conscious choice, is it? Like a rational decision to imitate. The sources talk about ideas spreading like a contagion.
Exactly. Tarde and also Borisides use terms like subconscious suggestion or even somnambulism, like an almost trance-like state where people just uncritically absorb the ideas and behaviors floating around them.
Which brings up a really crucial point about influence. If people are that susceptible to suggestion, who or what directs it?
Right. And this is where Laban introduced his powerful concept of prestige. He argued that pretty much anything that's held power in the world has relied on prestige. It's this almost hypnotic power that makes ideas accepted without debate, without question.
And Laban was specific about how you get prestige, right? It wasn't just magic. It was through affirmation, confidently stating things, repetition, just saying it over and over.
And that same contagion we just mentioned,
Right.
The idea itself starts to spread. He pointed to historical figures with intense personal prestige, Buddha, Jesus, Napoleon.
People whose sheer force of personality and confident statements seem to just bypass rational thought.
Compelling belief, yeah. And this understanding wasn't just academic theory, was it? It was actively applied.
You mean like Lippmann and Bernays, the early figures in public relations and propaganda?
Precisely. They explicitly used these insights into crowd psychology to, well, engineer consent, as Bernays put it, or manipulate public opinion.
Bernays, wasn't he Freud's nephew? He talked about how a knowledgeable few could guide the malleable, irrational masses by understanding their instincts.
Yeah, tapping into those subconscious drives. And Lippmann pointed out that people don't react to the real world directly. They build these pseudo-environments in their minds based on the information they get, the stereotypes they hold.
And those mental pictures are what they act on. So controlling the information, censoring inconvenient truths, that becomes incredibly powerful.
Hugely powerful. And this links back to leadership, naturally. What kind of leaders tend to emerge or succeed in this sort of environment?
Le Bon observed that crowds seem to prefer leaders who are confident, maybe even authoritarian, leaders who appeal to emotions, not intellect.
Complex arguments just fall flat. Simple, repetitive slogans, those resonate.
And Wilfred Bion, looking at it psychologically, added another layer. He suggested different types of groups based on their sort of unconscious, basic assumptions.
Like a fight-flight group always feeling threatened, or a dependence group looking for a strong parent figure.
Right. Those different groups will actually follow very different kinds of leaders, sometimes even preferring, Bion suggested, paranoid or seemingly mad figures if they somehow fit the group's underlying need or fear at that moment.
It's quite a thought. So let's reiterate the core takeaway from this section.
Yep.
Ideas and behaviors don't just get adopted through pure reason. They spread through these powerful, often subconscious, social forces, imitation, contagion.
And this whole process is heavily influenced, even directed by individuals or groups who command prestige.
A power often gained through confidence, repetition, and, crucially, the control of information. Understanding these mechanisms is key to seeing how collective opinion is often shaped, not just spontaneously formed.
That shift from the psychology, the mechanisms, to the broader societal structures feels quite natural, because influence often flows from structure, doesn't it?
It does. And these sources, well, they present a pretty stark view of societal structure, the persistent reality of elites and oligarchy.
Yeah, that's a cornerstone idea you find in thinkers like the Italian elitists, Mosca, Pareto, and especially Robert Michaels, and also someone like Malik.
They argue pretty persuasively based on their observations that all societies, regardless of how democratic they claim to be on the surface, are ultimately ruled by elites. A small minority inevitably holds the real power and influence.
Michels formalized this, didn't he, with his famous iron law of oligarchy?
He did. It's a really potent and maybe, discouraging idea for some. He basically stated, who says organization says oligarchy?
Meaning the very act of organizing a group, especially a large one, creates the conditions for an elite to emerge.
Exactly. Because as groups grow, you need structure, you need rules, you need full-time administrators, leaders. A distinct class emerges that controls the organization's machinery, its communication, its funds, its procedures.
And the ordinary members, the rank and file, they become dependent on this leadership for coordination, for information.
And power just inevitably concentrates in the hands of those few who run the bureaucracy. Even if the group started with the most democratic, idealistic goals, the bureaucracy itself becomes the power base.
Malik, looking maybe more broadly at society, made a similar point, didn't he, about hierarchy being indispensable in civilized life.
Yeah, he argued that things like economic oligarchies, governmental oligarchies, while they might not look perfectly democratic, are actually necessary for a complex society to function, for stability, security, prosperity. Civilization, in his view, depends on the cooperation and direction provided by unequals.
And the sources suggest this underlying structure means that things like democratic slogans or promises can sometimes be, well, Malik used the word sham.
Bernays was pretty blunt about it, too. He said public opinion is often just made up for it by skilled manipulators who understand the group mind.
And Lippmann observed that, in practice, even in democracies, leaders tend to focus their efforts on influencing other elites, the general population. They mainly receive filtered information, essentially propaganda.
Micho's also highlighted that the constant struggle underneath it all isn't usually about high principles. It's often between different elite factions. Old elites trying to hang on to power, new elites trying to break in and take over.
And they often use those principles or ideologies just as a pretext for a raw power struggle.
Precisely. So let's reinforce the key takeaway here, the reiteration point for this section.
Go ahead.
These sources argue forcefully that organized groups and societies, almost by their very nature, tend to be governed by a small, often self-perpetuating elite.
Michel's iron law suggests it's an inevitable outcome of organization itself,
making oligarchy a fundamental, perhaps unavoidable reality that often exists just beneath the surface, whatever the stated political system might be.
It's definitely a challenging perspective, especially for those of us in societies that really value democratic ideals.
It is. And it brings us right back to the individual. What happens when you, as an individual, try to stand apart? Especially in systems shaped by herd pull, mass suggestion, and these entrenched elites.
Yeah, the sources really emphasize just how difficult genuine independent thought actually is. Part of it is just how our minds work.
All right, we use stereotypes, mental categories, shortcuts to process the sheer complexity of the world. Lippmann wrote about this, William James too. We can't possibly deal with raw, unfiltered reality all the time, so we simplify it. We categorize.
And drawing on James and ideas like paradigm shifts from Thomas Kuhn, Gestalt psychology, the sources suggest these categories aren't just convenient mental filing cabinets. They actively shape what we perceive.
We literally see the world through these filters.
And Lippmann put it so well, challenging these deep-seated stereotypes feels like an attack on the very foundations of our personal universe. Because our reality is built on those stereotypes. It's psychologically deeply unsettling.
And then there's the argument that social organization itself, with its need for rules, roles, predictable behavior, it tends to crush out individuality. That's how Cedars put it, turning this civilized person into something like an automaton.
Blind obedience, conformity, they become the norm, maybe even praised as virtues for keeping things running smoothly.
So what about those who do try to think differently? The innovators, the creative minds, the ones who challenge existing frameworks, they face huge hurdles.
They're inherently out of sync with the group, aren't they? The group often prefers harmony, predictability over disruptive new ideas.
Thinkers like White, and the source author comments on this too, suggest that organizations might even actively blackball truly original minds geniuses because their disruptive insights, their non-conformity, threatens the comfortable status quo.
Harmony gets valued over potentially groundbreaking but maybe unsettling innovation.
And what's really striking, and maybe quite sobering, is the potential link that figures like Kay Jamison, Trotter, and the source author explore.
Between creativity, this act of breaking old mental categories and building new ones, and potential mental health challenges.
Exactly. The sheer psychological strain of being separate from the herd, of seeing the world differently, of constantly wrestling with new, perhaps disturbing perceptions. It might contribute to conditions like depression or bipolar disorder. It's a heavy idea.
This connects to John Boyd's work, doesn't it? His ideas on destruction and creation.
It does. He saw adapting effectively, especially in complex or changing environments, as requiring this active mental effort. You have to consciously break down your old mental models, your old categories, destruction, and then build new ones based on fresh observation and insight creation.
It's the absolute opposite of just passively conforming. It's a real struggle, a conscious effort to see clearly and adapt.
So the key takeaway here, looping right back to that initial tension. Yeah. True independent thought, innovation, just seeing things for yourself. It's presented in these sources as profoundly difficult. And it's often penalized, both by our own psychological tendencies and by social structures.
Breaking free from ingrained stereotypes, resisting that powerful pull of conformity, it requires real conscious effort. And it comes with potential costs, social costs, maybe even psychological ones.
Okay, let's try and tie some of the underlying forces together now, and maybe think about how the modern world fits into this whole picture.
Good idea. At the most basic level, what's driving all this behavior?
Well, the sources touch on fundamental physiological needs, like Clark Hall described, things we require to survive and thrive.
And leaders, propagandists like Bernays, they understood you could appeal directly to those needs, to instincts.
Yeah, which thinkers like Menger even linked to the basis of economic value itself. What satisfies a need has value. So understanding what people fundamentally need and instinctively react to gives you powerful leverage for influence.
And then there's just the raw power of habit. William James was so insightful on this.
Absolutely. He stressed how actions, especially when repeated, literally carve pathways in our nervous system. Carpenter had that phrase about the nervous system growing to the modes in which it has been exercised.
That law of habit, it explains why consistent actions, consistent exposure to ideas, even small things, end up shaping our character and future behavior so deeply.
And it means group norms, influences, once they're adopted and repeated, they become automatic habits. They become incredibly resistant to change or conscious challenge.
Okay, so now take all these dynamics we've discussed: the herd pull, subconscious suggestion, prestige, elite influence, the difficulty of independent thought, basic needs, the sheer force of habit, and layer the modern world on top.
Yeah, the source author raises a really interesting point here. While modern technology, the internet, might make certain kinds of old-fashioned censorship harder,
Right.
it also potentially makes the world feel like one big crowd. Information, misinformation, emotions, social pressures, they spread globally, instantaneously.
Leaving very little room to escape the influence of the herd.
Potentially, yeah. If your reputation, your perceived opinions, your social standing can be instantly judged and impacted across vast networks, the pressure to conform, to not step out of line, could be massively amplified.
So the dynamics the classic crowd psychologist described,
Yeah.
they're not gone. They might just be operating on a scale and at a speed they couldn't have dreamed of.
Making them potentially even more pervasive, more intense. It's like the mechanisms of influence now have this global, real-time feedback loop.
Wow. Okay, we have certainly covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, and we've tried to keep reiterating some of those really powerful and, yeah, maybe unsettling ideas from this collection of sources.
We definitely have. We've seen that fundamental tension, haven't we?
Yeah.
Between fitting in with the herd with all its comforts but also its costs, and that challenging, often lonely path of independent observation.
We explored how beliefs and behaviors spread, not just through reason, but through these potent social mechanisms like imitation, subconscious suggestion, often directed by leaders using prestige and controlling the flow of information.
We confronted that stark argument about organized groups and societies inevitably tending towards rule by a small elite. Michael's iron law, suggesting hierarchy might be a fundamental reality of human organization, like it or not.
And we circled back again and again to the individual, highlighting the huge difficulty of independent thought, how our minds rely on these simplifying stereotypes.
And how social structures and group pressures often penalize those who dare to see or think differently, sometimes perhaps even impacting their psychological well-being.
These sources, when you take them all together, they really paint a picture where the individual is profoundly shaped by their group, their leaders, their ingrained habits, and the intentional shaping of their information environment.
It's this complex interplay that makes collective life possible, but, according to these thinkers, often comes at the cost of true independent thought and maybe a clear-eyed perception of reality.
Ultimately, they really challenge that common idea of the fully rational, autonomous individual making purely logical choices.
Yeah, suggesting that subconscious influence, powerful group dynamics, and these persistent hierarchical structures play a far greater and often less acknowledged role in shaping who we are and what we believe.
So here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Something drawn directly from these insights we've been discussing.
If our perceptions are indeed filtered through these ingrained mental categories, these stereotypes, and if the pressure to conform constantly pushes us towards accepting simplistic, customary categories that are, easiest for the group as a whole to digest.
Then what does that imply about our ability, both collectively as societies and individually, to accurately understand and effectively respond to the real complexities of a rapidly changing world?
Heavy stuff for sure. Keep exploring these ideas.